Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Pearls of Wisdom podcast. Today, we are privileged to be joined by Hans Joas, who is a professor of sociology at the Humboldt University of Berlin and the University of Chicago. Today, we will be discussing his recent book, The Power of the Sacred, an alternative to the narrative of disenchantment. Professor Joas, how are you doing today?
How are you? I'm fine.
I'm great, thank you. My first question would be, can you tell us about yourself and your background and how you became a sociologist?
Yes, okay. I was born in Munich, in Bavaria, southern Germany, in 1948. I come from a rather poor, non-academic background. And what is also worth mentioning is that I come from a deeply Catholic milieu. But in Germany, after the Second World War, there was a kind of tension, of course, still to the Nazi past. Also, Catholics had become, let's say, seduced by Nazism, others not. And so there was a lot of conflicts and tensions still going on. For a long time, I had actually planned not to become a sociologist, but I was mostly interested in mathematics and physics. But I finished what is called in Germany the Gymnasium. I mean, it's not exactly the same as high school, in 1968. And at that time, as you probably know, the heyday of student movement and other social movements in the Western world, not only in the Western world, I decided I should do something that is more, let's say, socially and politically relevant. And so I decided in favor of sociology as my main discipline, although it's not fully true what I just said, because I was as attracted by history as by sociology. And it is somewhat accidental that I ended up in sociology, but I always kept this interest in history as well. And I would say I'm fortunate that I spent the last 30 years in interdisciplinary programs. So when you mentioned the University of Chicago, I'm a member not only of the sociology department there, but of the Committee on Social Thought, which is very interdisciplinary. And in Germany, I was the director of a small institute for advanced study called Max Weber Center, so named after Max Weber.
Yes.
Which is also an interdisciplinary program.
Yes.
So much on my background.
So we'll get to Max Weber later in this interview. So, and you mentioned that you were raised Catholic. So I was wondering, maybe you could tell us if your Catholic faith has informed or influenced your work in sociology, or perhaps vice versa.
Yes, I mean, it certainly has. But the question always makes me a little bit nervous, you know, because in many academic milieus, it's not so easy to be Catholic. So that, for example, I get reviews of my books in which the reviewer discusses at length how my Catholicism might have distorted my argument. And of course, my claim is that what I write in my scholarly, sociological, historical, philosophical writings is true, so to speak. I mean, and has to be accepted by everybody, whether they feel close to Catholicism or not. So in that sense, I mean, I'm not a theologian, and what I'm doing and what I'm writing is not, let's say, immediately based on the presupposition of a specific religious faith. On the other hand, it would, of course, be misleading to deny that at least the choice of topics in my work has something to do with this religious background. And sometimes I realize that only after the fact, so to speak. For example, my doctoral dissertation was something that then was turned into a book, also published in English, a biography of a major American thinker of the 19th and early 20th century, namely George Herbert Mead, one of the great pragmatists and one of the founders of social psychology. The original German title of that book, the English title is just George Herbert Mead, but the original German title is something that may sound strange to some, practical intersubjectivity. I mean, this says something about the crucial role interpersonal relationships play for infantile development, for example, and so on. And at a certain point, I realized that what I did in that book is to some extent an attempt to turn the deeply Christian idea and ideal of neighborly love into something scientific, so to speak. I mean, if you are expected to love your neighbor, that presupposes that human beings have the cognitive ability to see the world through the eyes of the other, for example. So not to see the world only through your own eyes, but to have empathy, as we say today, for example, and to draw the moral consequences from the cognitive ability of empathy. So I would say there is in that sense, not a Catholic, but a deeply Christian motive at work here. But what I say, to repeat that, is of course not reducible to the religious motivation. I mean, I find very intriguing what you ask when you say, and vice versa. That is a very interesting question, I think. I mean, to what extent does my scholarly work have repercussions also on my religious faith? And I think it has, in the sense that I would say an important task for believers today is to articulate their faith not just in a traditional, in this case, Christian language, but to re-articulate it in new ways that makes the faith understandable to people who have not been influenced, affected by this faith before. That's probably more relevant for Europe than for North America. You know, I mean, it's more relevant in deeply secularized intellectual milieus than in religious intellectual milieus.
Yes. And just one of the reasons why I wanted to ask that question is because I found that not only are like sociology is often like painted as, you know, a field that is unfriendly towards religion, and I also find that many religious people themselves are suspicious of sociology. Like I remember the Tolstoy quotation where he says that that you quote in your book, where he says that sociology is the study of how bad people lived in the past, or something to that effect.
Yes.
So, all right. So now we can start talking about your book. So I guess a natural question would be, what prompted you to write this book, The Power of the Sacred?
I think I have a very clear answer to that question, you know. So let's say in the last 2 or 3 decades, a crucial topic of the sociology of religion, but also of discussions in the wider public about religion, was whether the so-called secularization thesis is correct or not. Now, secularization thesis means the assumption that modernization necessarily leads to the decline of religion. Now, a lot more could be said about that, of course, because it's not totally clear what modernization means and so on. And I've written about that in an earlier book that's also out in English under the title Faith as an Option, published by Stanford University Press. But now, the interesting question is, if it is true, and I think it is empirically true, that secularization in this sense of decline of religion, at least for a very long time in the 19th and 20th centuries, was almost exclusively a European phenomenon. starting in the 18th century and then getting stronger and stronger over the following, let's say, 200 or 250 years. Mm-hmm. Now, the crucial question that led to this new book is, mm-hmm. do we explain these modern European processes of secularization out of the conditions in Europe in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries? Or do we assume that this modern European secularization has a kind of long religious prehistory, so that it had already somehow been built into the Judeo-Christian tradition, for example, for a very long time? Now, some of the most important European thinkers of the late 19th century made exactly that second assumption, namely that we cannot understand modern European secularization just out of the contemporary conditions, so to speak. I give you an example. Friedrich Nietzsche said or wrote in his book on the genealogy of morals that truthfulness is a crucial Christian value. Mm-hmm. Now, or sincerity. Now, if Christians emphasize truthfulness or sincerity so much, they will not be able to avoid taking a position to the fact that, for example, there are contradictions within the Bible.
Sure. That
the same story may be narrated in a different way in one mm-hmm. gospel than in the other gospel. Mm-hmm. So they cannot simply forget that, but they have to start studying the Bible, so to speak, mm-hmm. or studying the conditions out of which the Bible emerged and so on. And that will lead them to deny the totally, let's say, revealed character of the text of the Bible, so that the Christian value itself will over time lead to a decline of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And Nietzsche's view is one very influential among philosophers. The more sophisticated such view, however, is that of Max Weber. And so I decided this is such an important piece of thinking, more important than the secularization thesis, that one has to address that in a very thorough manner and to find out whether it is tenable or not. And the result of my book is it is not, but it's a long story that leads to that conclusion.
And all right, so my next question would be, in your work in the sociology of religion, you mentioned that there are some vague terms in the sociology of religion, such as modernization and secularization, and we could also include religion in that category. So I was wondering, do you adopt a particular working definition of religion in your work, or do you use several definitions?
Yes, but you know, I do not think that one can simply start with a definition, so to speak, with a kind of arbitrary definition. So let me explain that what is specific about my approach with regard to religion. And what is specific is that the crucial element for my understanding of religion is sacredness. And I follow certain thinkers, mostly the great French sociologist Émile Durkheim, who changed the relationship between the definition of religion and the definition of the sacred. Let me explain. For a long time, people assumed, and still there are people who assume, that to call something sacred always takes place within the framework of a religion, so that people who are not religious claim that nothing is sacred to them, so to speak, because for them it follows anything can only be sacred if it is part of the framework, the interpretive framework of a religion. Now, what happened in Durkheim and others was that they changed that in the sense of there are human experiences that lead to the sacralization of particular objects in the world, of persons in the world, or of ideas in the world, so to speak. And religions then are kind of secondary phenomena, namely attempts to systematize these spontaneous sacralizations, to articulate them, while the processes of sacralization themselves are to a large extent pre-reflective. They take place, they are not the result of reasoning, or to organize human practices that allow access to the sacred religious rituals, for example. So the crucial thing with regard to my definition of religion is the understanding of the sacred, a specific understanding of the emergence of sacredness out of human action and experience. Now, of course, you could immediately respond and say, but that merely moves the question of the definition of religion to the question of the definition of the sacred. That is true, but I mean, there is no 0 point, so to speak, from which one can start. One has to elaborate a specific understanding here.
Yep, that's fair enough. So now, in your book, you discuss the possibility of a dispassionate academic study of the religious enterprise. We talked about this a bit before. So to this end, in the first 3 chapters of your book, you address methodological issues pertaining to the academic study of religion in history, psychology, and sociology. I believe you call these empirical disciplines that study religion. So, and you devote the first chapter of your book to a discussion of David Hume's Natural History of Religion. So maybe you could tell us about a bit about your assessment of Hume's historiographical project.
Yes, I mean, the purpose of the first 3 chapters, as you said, is to say not only theologians and philosophers have dealt with religion, but also empirical disciplines. I mean, history of religion, psychology of religion, sociology of religion. And of course, I couldn't write, let's say, a history of the history of religion, a history of the psychology of religion, and so on. So what I did in the first 3 chapters was I chose, let's say, crucial original constellations out of which history of religion, psychology of religion, and sociology of religion emerged. So the first chapter deals with the great Scottish philosopher and historian, David Hume, because he was the first one, I would say, who wrote something he called a natural history of religion. Now, there is some controversy what exactly he meant by natural history, because the term only appears in the title and not in the text. But for the moment, and without going into all the details of these controversies, I think it's clear that he wanted to write a kind of universal history of religion that is not based on theological presuppositions. So it's not that you believe that, let's say, God sent his son into the world or something like that, but to look at all the religions in a kind of detached and neutral manner. Now, this, of course, was not completely neutral, because he clearly was a religious skeptic, if not a critic of Christianity and so on. So what I do in the first chapter is I say, what exactly are his main empirical claims in this first attempt to write a universal history of religion that is not based on theological presuppositions? I discuss these claims, and this serves the purpose to demonstrate that whatever the religious or anti-religious presuppositions of a historian in this case are, one can argue about these claims. I do not have to share his religious or anti-religious presuppositions. I can take his claims and discuss them theoretically and empirically. And to make that more impressive, so to speak, I added a few pages on the contemporary German reception of David Hume's thinking, particularly of a deeply Christian thinker, very famous, Johann Gottfried Herder, who was a great fan of Hume, but also deeply Christian. So this may sound paradoxical, but one can explain that, I think, if one shows that Herder also was interested in a kind of universal history of religion that is not simply based on presuppositions of faith, but did not share with Hume the understanding of experience, had a different understanding of experience, had a much better understanding of human linguistic or symbolic expression, and reconstructed the same history, but in a different way. So for me, this opens, this supports the claim that you can be a Christian believer, a Jewish believer, a Muslim, or whatever, as soon as you enter the discourse about, in this case, the history of religion, you do not have to become a secularist. Everybody is welcome, so to speak, but what is being dealt with is the historical claims themselves. And one has to argue about them and not reduce them to the presupposition of a thinker. And then in chapters 2 and 3, I do the same with regard to the psychology of religion and the sociology of religion.
Thank you for your insightful comments, Professor Joas. So now, I guess, and so maybe now would be a good time to discuss Weber's Narrative of Disenchantment. But maybe you could tell us a bit about who Max Weber was and his significance, both past and present, for sociology.
Yes, Max Weber is indisputably the classical founder and most important reference figure in the discipline of sociology. Maybe there are two, Max Weber, and I mentioned before the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. But these are the two constitutive figures for the project, so to speak, of a new discipline called sociology. Now, of course, a new discipline, the founder of a new discipline doesn't come out of that discipline. So he came out of the study of law and economic history, or legal history, economic history, you could say. And since you are asking, produced his most important writings at the end of the 19th and the first 2 decades of the 20th century. He died in 1920. The most famous among his writings are a huge book that is actually more a compilation of fragments he left when he died, published under the title Economy and Society, and a 3-volume collection of his studies of the economic ethics of the world religions. The most influential of those texts is his essay on Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, or of modern capitalism. This, particularly after the Second World War and in the United States, became absolutely crucial texts for the social sciences, but also for let's say, for a self-understanding of the Western world. When I think it was in the late 1990s, the International Sociological Association asked its members what the most important sociological book ever written is. Weber's Economy and Society won the competition, so to speak. Yeah, so there is no doubt, so to speak, that for the emergence of this new discipline, but also for many, many writings today, Max Weber's theories, I mean, some people say he's the Einstein of sociology. Something that's ridiculous in a certain sense, but just to characterize the enormously crucial importance of this author.
So you must be very brave for criticizing his views.
Yes, exactly. You're totally right. And perhaps I mentioned before that I was the director of this Max Weber Center. I had the title Max Weber Professor for 9 years before I left that institute. But I think, I mean, it is, so to speak, in Max Weber's spirit, it is at least in the spirit of scientific progress to ask whether what a certain classical author said is really correct. Right. And after many years of study, so to speak, I came to the conclusion that one crucial element of Weber's thinking, namely this, I don't say theory of disenchantment, but narrative of disenchantment, cannot really be defended.
And sorry, can you perhaps elaborate on that distinction between the theory and narrative of disenchantment?
Yeah, no, I mean, narrative is a kind of the basic structure of a way to analyze history. Theory sounds more like, let's say, law-like propositions. When this happens, this will follow, something like that. But I emphasize the distinction because, you know, there is not one writing by Weber in which he really defends what he means by disenchantment. It's a strange thing. I could tell you in the form of an anecdote that once in Chicago, a student came to my office hours and said she wants to work on Weber. And I said, well, which writings are you already familiar with? And she answered, his theory of disenchantment. And I said, but that's an interesting response because I've never found that in his writings. What he says about disenchantment, he says en passant, you know, he says in different of his writings. So one thing I realized in the book is that I collected all the passages where he ever uses the term to disenchant, disenchanted, disenchantment, so to speak, and to interpret them in their specific contexts. And I found out, I would say, that he uses this term in a deeply ambiguous way.
Right. So you just anticipated my next question, because I was going to ask you to summarize Weber's narrative of disenchantment. Yeah. So maybe I didn't. Then maybe you could tell us. Is there like a particular understanding of that narrative, you know, among scholars or among the general public?
Yes. Yes. I mean, in the general public, the term is often used, of course, in very loose and even contradictory ways. I mean, you can find people who say disenchantment is mostly a result of modern scientific progress. Whereas Max Weber, for example, said the world historical process of disenchantment reached its high point and conclusion in John Calvin. So, I mean, both statements cannot be true at the same time.
Right, right.
Yeah. Maybe, I mean, I would have to do two things now. One is briefly characterize what this narrative of disenchantment is. And the other is show why the use of the term is so ambiguous. So let me do the first thing first, namely, I think Weber, and that has proven to be extremely plausible to many people, traces the prehistory of modern European secularization. I say it in a very superficial way, of course, a very summary way, in the following way. Namely, it all starts with a struggle of the Old Testament prophets against magic. So de-magification is the kind of first step in the history of disenchantment. Now, in Weber's views, and that's a typically Protestant view of history, of course, understanding of history, let's say this original impulse, anti-magical prophetic spirit, is still alive in early Christianity, or even intensified in early Christianity. But then in medieval Christianity, there happens a kind of regression, a re-magification, against which the reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin rebelled. So the Reformation, in this view, is a kind of revitalization of the prophetic anti-magical spirit. This spirit of the Reformation then allows a certain progress of modern science, the modern scientific revolution. This is developed into a new worldview where the world is seen as a kind of a universe of causal determinations, in which human values and ideals cannot play a role. This leads to the philosophy of enlightenment, and this view leads to the crisis of, let's say, existential meaning in Europe around 1900 and in the time of the First World War. So that would be a very brief characterization of the narrative of disenchantment. So everything starts with the Old Testament prophets, and over time, so to speak, over a process of 2,500 years, leads to modern European secularization. And for Weber, Weber does not say that in a triumphal voice, not in the sense of, oh, we are so happy that we have finally gotten rid of Christianity or of religion. But he says that in a deeply melancholy or tragic way. We have lost something that we cannot revitalize, but we are poorer than people in the past, so to speak, but we cannot return to that past and so on. That's the undertone. Now, what I try to show is that he uses the term disenchantment with at least three different meanings. One is demagification, as I just said. Another, and one would have to speak at length what that exactly means, is desacralization. And the third is what I call, in a rather ugly, with a rather ugly term, detranscendentalization. I mean, the loss of the idea that there is real transcendence, that there is something that is fundamentally different from the mundane, from the earthly, so to speak. And that Weber can produce this concatenation, so to speak, of processes only because of this ambiguity of the term. So that as soon as we start distinguishing these different meanings, we see that there is not a unilinear process, there is not a unidirectional development, so to speak, but that there are indeed processes of demagification in history, but also processes of new magification or re-magification, that there are processes of the loss of transcendence, but also processes of the emergence of new intense ways to conceptualize transcendence, that there is desacralization, but also resacralization or new sacralizations. And of course, there is not only secularization, there is also religious revitalization. So history becomes much more open again when we have deconstructed or destroyed the narrative of disenchantment.
I see. All right. So you're very good at anticipating my future question. Maybe you sort of touched on this a little bit, but I wanted maybe to talk a bit more about the Reformation. So in the fourth chapter of your book, you raised the following question, and I quote: "To what extent did the Reformation, as Weber wrote, amount to the final victory of demagification?" So that at least that's how your translator translated the question. So how would you answer that question?
It did not. I mean, the first part of an answer is, of course, one should not write the history of Protestantism as if there was no Catholicism left after the Reformation, so to speak. That happens quite frequently, particularly in exclusively Protestant countries. For example, in Scandinavia, in Sweden, you can see it. And look at certain signs on buildings. It says this is a building from Catholic times. It means in Sweden from pre-Reformation times, but for people from Catholic countries, for example, or for Catholics, it sounds strange to say from Catholic times as if Catholicism ended in the 16th century. So not only in that sense, but also, I mean, Protestants in the 16th century, for example, clearly produced new and, let's say, Protestant versions of magification. I mean, I like the anecdote about the beds in which Martin Luther slept when he traveled through Germany, and that the Protestant believers could, I mean, treated a bed in which Martin Luther had slept as a sacred object, carved small pieces of wood.
That's ironic.
And kept them and believed in the healing power of that. So there is a spontaneous reimagification, even under the guidance of an anti-magical Protestant spirit. And I sometimes, for example, but that comes from a totally different cultural context, in North Korea, I mean, the communist leaders are always the object of the attribution of magical qualities. The communist, the chairman of the Communist Party in North Korea, when he goes to a factory, I mean, he looks at the production process in that factory, says something, and then everybody is surprised how wise this advice is, and immediately the efficiency of production increases. This is, of course, kind of ridiculous, but I think it shows that there are spontaneous processes of magification, and that there is no point in world history at which magic has finally come to an end. Not the Reformation and not the emergence of Marxism or any other point in history.
Yes, I hope to one contemporary proponent of the view that the Reformation is responsible for secularizing society is the Notre Dame historian Brad Gregory, and I hope to have him on the program soon, and we can get his perspective as well.
But he has a totally, I mean, I know his book, The Unintended Reformation. I find it very, very interesting. It's deeply controversial. It's very interesting. But I don't think that he would disagree with what I just said.
All right, fair enough. So as we approach the end of our interview, I'd also be curious to know if while conducting the research for your book, you came across or made any discoveries or findings that maybe took you by surprise, or?
No, I mean, that happens indeed when you write such long books, where it's closer to my heart, perhaps, or to my mind at the moment, to say that in the book I'm presently writing, I started a certain chapter, for example, in early February, with a plan to write 30 pages and to end this chapter by the end of February. And actually I ended it in June, and it has not 30 pages now, but 125. So in the process of writing, I mean, you constantly discover, let's say, inconsistencies in your argument, additional material you have to bring in, and so on. Yeah, but with regard to this book, The Power of the Sacred, I would not say that after finishing it, something happened to me that makes me revise it now. And I can say that, although maybe I shouldn't say that in Germany, 500-page discussion volume is about to come out. I mean, a collection of articles about my book. And I just this summer wrote a long reply to the critics, so to speak. But in this particular case, I don't think I have to revise any major argument of the book. There are always details one could add and so on. Yeah.
All right.
But that's not always true. I mean, other books of mine, I would say maybe 2 years later, I would, if I had a chance, I would reformulate certain passages or a whole chapter.
Yes. And you said that the 500-page book is did you say it was already done, or has it been published?
It's not out. It's finished, but not out.
And would you happen to know when it might appear in English, if at all?
This discussion volume, I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, great. And so maybe while we wait patiently, perhaps you can tell us a bit about your general impression of the feedback or criticisms or reviews that you have received.
Yes. I mean, it is different from country to country. So far, the book is out in German, where it got many reviews, including in all the leading newspapers, and was taken very seriously. Then the first translation that came out was the French translation, and I'm very happy to say that the same is true for France. I mean, Le Monde, which is the leading French daily newspaper, had a full-page review of it, praising the book, and even at the end of the year, calling it one of the, I think, 30 most important new books of the year, 2020 in this case. Now, for the English publication, it's probably too early. I mean, I get such invitations like yours for Zoom interviews and similar things. But actually, I haven't seen any review yet, but the book is out only, I don't remember at the moment, 6 months or less than.
Yes, it came out in April. Yeah.
Okay, yes.
With Oxford.
Yes. So I find it quite suspenseful which reviews will come in English.
All right. I'll let you know if I come across any. I'll email you any reviews I might find. And so I think you told me in a private correspondence that you have a book coming out with Oxford University Press in English. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that book?
Yes. I should say perhaps what I avoided to say in the preface to the two previous books, that I consider this book, The Power of the Sacred, which is the main subject matter of our conversation, as the first volume of a trilogy. I didn't want to say that because, it's very embarrassing when you say in a book, this is the first volume of a trilogy, and then you run out of steam, so to speak, and never publish volume 2 and 3. But now volume 2 is out in German, came out last year, and has now been accepted by the same publisher that did The Power of the Sacred, Oxford University Press, for publication in English. So it always takes a lot of time then, because the book has to be translated, and it's even longer than The Power of the Sacred is. And I've already written several hundred pages of the third volume, so I now have the courage to speak about the whole project, so to speak. Now, briefly on this second volume, so to speak, which has, in English, will have the title, probably, if I translate the German title, Under the Spell of Freedom. Now, the point is the following. So, the first volume deals with the narrative of disenchantment, and indirectly, so to speak, therefore, with the secularization thesis. So, to put it in a very, I don't know how to put that, nonchalant or something like the casual way. The first volume addresses those who think religion is about to disappear anyway, and this is a good thing, or maybe an ambivalent thing, as in Weber. The second volume deals with, let's say, the Hegelian, not the Weberian, but the Hegelian narrative in a similar way. Namely, that religion is not about to disappear, but all religion, except one, is a danger for political freedom. Except one means, except, now different people would say different things here, except the Judeo-Christian tradition, except Christianity, or except Protestant Christianity. Now, Hegel clearly was of the opinion, except Protestant Christianity. Catholic Christianity for Hegel was an enemy, an adversary of political freedom, and Judaism too. So the second narrative, so to speak, is an enormously Christianocentric and Eurocentric view of the history of religion. Namely that the history of religion leads to a highest form, that is Christianity. The history of Christianity leads to a highest form, namely Protestant Christianity. And Protestant Christianity leads to the institutionalization of political freedom in the Prussian constitutional monarchy of the 19th century. Without all the turmoil of the French Revolution, the ideals of the Enlightenment and of the Revolution become realized, so to speak. Now, I do not say that all the people who believe in similar narratives take this directly from Hegel. Some of them will never have studied Hegel, so to speak, but the narrative is in many minds. And there is an enormously important parallel, so to speak, but it's not simply a parallel, in the Marxist narrative, which one could say pushes the Hegelian narrative one epoch further. Namely, it's not the Prussian monarchy that realizes political freedom, but socialism. And to achieve socialism, one has to get rid of all religion, including Protestant Christianity, so to speak. So what I do in this second volume is I show in 4 main respects why this narrative is also wrong and what happened in the theory of religion after Hegel and I say after Nietzsche that enables us to tell a totally different story, a story that has a more adequate understanding of the faith, of political freedom, and of history than the Hegelian and Marxist narrative. And you will be able to anticipate in the 3rd volume, the one I'm presently writing, is an attempt to tell the, let's say, in positive terms, the counter narrative to both the Weberian and the Hegelian narrative.
Well, I'm very eager to read those 2 volumes once they appear in English, hopefully. So before we draw this interview to a close, is there anything you would like to say or leave with our listeners?
I'm happy about your interest, at least your personal interest, and I hope that some of your listeners, I mean, these books are not easy stuff, probably. But I always say, you know, for example, when you dispute such influential narratives like the Weberian and the Hegelian, it's not sufficient to say, by the way, I don't agree with that. Why should anybody be interested in whether I agree with them or not? The crucial thing is to argue in great systematic and historical detail. And that, of course, is not easy. I mean, you have to deal with the state of the art in a number of disciplines and sub disciplines. Yes. So I'm happy that the power of the sacred, as I said, at least in German and French speaking intellectual milieus, has found such an intense reception, and we will see what happens in the United States. In the past, my books, the fate of the books in different countries is very, very different. It's an interesting experience in itself. And maybe Canada, since you are in Canada, not in the US.
I'm in Canada.
I always mostly have the US in mind, so to speak. But maybe the situation in Canada is also different in this regard.
Right. And if I may ask just one last question, are there any books you would recommend for someone who's interested in delving deeper into the topic of secularization, disenchantment, or reenchantment, sacralization?
Yes. There are some authors I feel close to, and whose writings, therefore, I would recommend. One book that in my eyes is perhaps the best book written on religion and the universal history of religion in the last decades is the book by the late American sociologist of religion, Robert Bellah.
Yes.
The title is Religion in Human Evolution.
Yes.
And Bella and I were very close, also personally, to each other. So although I never was his student, I consider him a kind of, let's say, academic teacher. Although we first met when I was 50. So it's not really a professor-student relationship, but I admired him and recommend his writings, particularly this book. And unfortunately, he died before he was able to finish the second volume that he had planned to write. But the fragments for the second volume will come out in English in a year or so. And another author I deeply recommend is the Spanish-born American sociologist of religion, José Casanova.
Yes.
Whose book
at Georgetown,
At Georgetown, exactly. Whose book, Public Religions in the Modern World, has made an enormous effect on the landscape in the sociology of religion, and who is now working on a very interesting history of the history of the Jesuits in connection with different phases of globalization. I mean, the Jesuits as actors in the processes of globalization, and he has already, together with Tom Banchoff at Georgetown, published a collection of articles about the history of the Jesuits. I think the title is The Jesuits in Globalization.
Okay.
But he's also working on a monograph about this topic, and that is also we are all looking forward to.
Okay.
But I could go on and recommend many important writings, but I think if you look at the references in my books, you will find them.
We'll do. All right. Dr. Joas, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great day. And thank you once again. Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.